but I'll just add that Nick got his PhD from Cornell in 2001 with a really, really clever, amazing study that really got my attention, studying morality, showing that people are actually pretty accurate at predicting the ethical behavior of others. But when they try to predict their own behavior, they're way too rosy. And this kind of hypocrisy sets up no end of problems. So very, very important work in moral psychology and social psychology. And ever since then, Nick has been the leader, I'd say, in studying, well, how we understand what others think, believe, feel, and want. In his wonderful book, Mind-Wise, he also wrote a contextual influences slide. So we thought Nick would be the perfect person to begin sort of the research base. What do we know about morality, moral psychology, that then can be useful in improving business ethics. So join me in welcoming Nick. Thanks. So now, how do we... Oh, I got it. Okay.
All right, so first, thanks to John for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. It's a great honor to speak to you today, and it's a fun thing to do. It's great to speak at conferences where you're bringing people together from diverse sorts of areas and backgrounds. When researchers meet with practitioners, people actually working out in the real world, we gain a lot. What we gain is we gain enrichment. We gain a better understanding of the real kinds of challenges and the real contextual culture and texture that you're dealing with in daily life, the real kinds of complexities. That enriches our research. That gives us problems to study. And an ideal world would also give us collaborations. That is, would give us people running businesses or companies or industries who might be willing to let us do some experimental work with them. What we hope as researchers to give to practitioners is a bit of refinement. This is somewhat challenging for us to do as researchers. Everybody in this room who's speaking, I believe, today is trained with a background in psychology of one variety or another. It's a bit challenging to teach psychological science to audiences, in part because everybody in the room is an expert already in the thing that you're talking about. That is, by virtue of being born a human being, you are an expert in other people. Everybody in this room spends endless amounts of time thinking about others' thoughts and beliefs and attitudes, understanding why they behave as they behave. All of you have a ton of common sense about why good people sometimes do bad things. And so you're already starting from a domain of expertise. What behavioral science and psychology does isn't inherently overturn that expertise or that common sense. The problem we find with common sense isn't that it's inherently wrong, it's that there's just too much of it. And some of the things that we know or that we believe about human beings just isn't right. As Albert Einstein once said, the whole of science is nothing more than the refinement of everyday thinking, and that's more true when we're dealing with psychological processes than in any other field because everybody's already an expert in psychology. And so what I think is a big barrier for many of us in managing ethics appropriately out in the world, whether in our daily lives or our professional lives, isn't so much the things we know, it's the things we know that just aren't quite right. The myths or the mistaken understandings or the mistaken perceptions that we have about what actually guides morality. And what behavioral science can do is add some refinement to that kind of common sense. And so what I want to do today is to start by talking what I think are four common myths about morality. And by myth, I don't mean something that's inherently wrong. In fact, there's truth to every one of these myths. But a myth tends to be exaggerated. It's not as true as we tend to think it is, or it's more sophisticated than we believe it is. And I think these myths are important because they help to explain why we often mismanage ethics in our organizational or daily lives. And I also think it helps to identify a better way forward. And third, I think it helps to explain why we're all here today. If everybody understood the actual science behind ethical behavior, we wouldn't need to have a conference telling you about it, and we wouldn't be in business as researchers. So let's start with what I think are the first of the four common myths. Surely there are others. These are the ones that I think are most important. First common myth about morality is that it's about the people. That there are good guys and there are bad guys in the world, and the good guys do good things, and the bad guys do bad things. And if you can just identify those personality traits that differentiate the good guys from the bad guys, you could spot them, keep the good guys in your jobs, and keep the bad guys out of them. This is just endemic almost everywhere we look in our culture, that we tend to attribute behavior to individuals rather than the context they find themselves in, and this is certainly true in ethics. So we look out in the world, and presumably you can tell the good guys from the bad guys. So the good guys are the ones wearing the white hats, and the bad guys are the ones wearing the black hats. Anybody who's ever watched a Western movie understands this. We see this in our world religions as a fundamental tension, a fight between not a sort of good and a sort of bad, but all good and all bad, an extreme differentiation between black and white. We see this in our comic book superheroes who are all good, who are all bad. We even see it in our movies. This is what the bad guys in Hollywood look like. Now, this isn't actually what the bad guys look like in everyday life. What the bad guys really look like in everyday life are like this guy. This guy doesn't look any different from any of the rest of us, but this is what evil in the world looks like. This is Ted Bundy. He's a serial rapist and a serial murderer. That's what evil looks like. And this is what evil sounds like.
If you kill somebody, I'd take this book and beat you to death with it, and I wouldn't feel a thing. It'd be just like walking to the drugstore.
That's Charles Manson. That's what evil sounds like. And what both of these two men represent is a particular kind of evil that does really exist in the world. There are black hats in the world. Psychologists refer to these folks as psychopaths. And they have a particular kind of personality profile, and it's pretty extreme. They tend to lack remorse and empathy for others. They have impulsive and erratic behavior, superficial charm. They tend to get along very well with people, at least when you first meet them. They tend to be insincere, though, and unreliable, and they don't have very good social relations, certainly not long-term social relations with other people. Now, there's some good news here. The good news is that there aren't very many of these people, as far as we can tell. In fact, almost none. So psychologists estimate it's probably less than 1% of the general population were people you would consider as psychopaths. There's a widely quoted myth that that psychopaths tend to congregate sort of in this area of town, really right here. That also, as far as we can tell, turns out not to be true. That myth that 10% of Wall Streeters are certifiable psychopaths is often attributed to Robert Hare, who's done much of this work in psychopathy. But even he acknowledges that, in fact, he has no data that shows anything like this. The closest he has is a study of salespeople where he found 4% of salespeople in one particular sample he had were psychopaths, but there's nothing that suggests that 10% of Wall Streeters are psychopaths. And the best news is that it's probably not any of you. And it's probably not anybody that's working for you either, or at least it's not very likely to be. Well, how do we know? We know because we can measure it. You can measure it if you want to. You can find out. It's actually not too hard. You can give people personality scales, and because psychopaths really don't care what you think of them too much, they fill this out quite honestly. And then it turns out there are two different dimensions of psychopathy. One is empathy, right? Feeling empathy for others, or lack of empathy, as the case may be. Higher numbers here mean less empathy. The other factor is antisocial behavior. So you don't really care for other people, and you're kind of a jerk, right? That's a psychopath. Now, what I'm going to show you here are data from my MBA class. These are the future leaders, ostensibly, of the world. These could be people in your organizations. They could even come and work in this part of town. When I teach my ethics class, I have them all fill out a psychopathy scale. And what do they look like? Well, this is what they look like. They're sort of scattered around here, and as with any distribution, there's some variance here. Now, what you're really concerned about is this upper quadrant up here, people who score high on both dimensions. Now, as it happens, the average of my group, this was when I taught it over the winter, is actually, the average on both of these dimensions is actually somewhat lower than the average US population. So maybe Chicago MBA students are just particularly empathic and pro-social. I don't know, I doubt that, but they look pretty normal, frankly, is what they look like. What's more, there's really nobody who you'd be horribly concerned about. What you're worried about are people who are 2 standard deviations or beyond the mean, folks up here in this quarter. Of course, you notice the one who's in that ballpark, but by and large, these people look shockingly normal. And that turns out to be the truth of most unethical behavior. And we've learned this over many years as psychologists. That's really the shocking thing. I think the surprising thing to the intuitive psychologist is that a lot of bad stuff can be done by all of these people here. These people are certainly not immune to doing unethical things by any means. Good people do bad things. That's the real challenge for ethics. The watershed moment for realizing this in psychology was with the Milgram Studies that I'm sure you've heard about. I won't talk about them in detail here. He recruited people for a short memory study, a learning study. The teacher, which was you, met a learner here. You were asked to deliver the learner electric shocks for every wrong answer the learner received, starting at 15 volts, going up 15 volts, all the way up to potentially 450 volts. You were urged by the experimenter to continue with this. Some versions of the experiment that Milgram conducted, you had reason to believe that you probably killed the person on the other side of the wall at some point when you hit about 300 volts. Now, what makes this amazing is not what participants actually did in this experiment. That's a misunderstanding. It's not what made this experiment so memorable. What made this experiment so memorable is how we expected we and others would behave if we were in that experiment, and people behaved nothing like that. So Milgram knew that people's intuitions about behavior, their myths about morality in this case, were important, and in fact he measured them. So he asked people, 3 groups of people he reported in this book, others have done this in other ways, he asked people to predict how far they would go if they were actually in the experiment. None of you think you are psychopaths, of course, I presume, and none of these people did either. What he found was that people basically thought they wouldn't go very far at all. Nobody, in fact, thought that they would go beyond 300 volts. It turns out, though, that people were just fundamentally, you could argue, wrong about themselves, because when Milgram actually ran the experiment, nobody stopped before 300 volts in the baseline condition. And a full 65% of people went all the way to the end. What made this experiment amazing wasn't that 65 people went to the end, it's that nobody believed anybody would. That's what made this experiment amazing. Now, unless you think this is something just about, I don't know, compliant people in the 1970s, I don't think that really describes that generation very well, but lest you imagine that, rest assured that this experiment does replicate. It's not something that IRB's allowed many people to do, but it was done not that long ago at UC Santa Clara. And what they found were exactly the same effects that Milgram found, 70% obedience with voice feedback, which was exactly the same rate, essentially, as what Milgram found. The replication also measured a bunch of other things that you might expect would matter, other personality variables, like can we identify the good guys and the bad guys? Can we find the black hats and the white hats? And the answer was basically no, not really. Not that much. So, for instance, there was no gender difference. You might imagine there would be, but like with many psychological gender differences, this one was small. In this case, it was actually non-existent. And it was, there were some individual difference measures that did predict how far people went, but not a lot. So empathic concern, how concerned you are for others' well-being, predicted how far people went a little bit. It's a statistically significant correlation. That's not a crushing amount of variance by any means. So personality does matter. There are good guys and bad guys, or people who are more likely to behave in an unethical way than others, but we have a hard time identifying who it is. How would you actually change behavior in this situation? Well, Milgram had a good insight about this. He suggested you don't get different people. You change up the environment. Change up the context that people are in. And when he did that, in fact, he found huge effects on behavior. So he ran full-on 25 different replications, or conditions, essentially, additional conditions, on this particular experiment. And you find hugely varying rates of obedience, depending on which particular condition you're in. So this was the baseline condition, 65%. If you had to touch the victim, you actually had to be physically connected to the person. Obedience rates went down. If the authority figure was actually the person you were shocking, nobody shocked at that point. If you had an authority, if you had somebody, another authority figure who told you you didn't have to continue, then obedience rates went to 0. If you had a peer, somebody else with you, who said, I'm not doing this, then you went along, you didn't either. But if you had a peer who went along with it, then obedience rates went even higher, to 93%. That is, manipulating the context, particularly the social context, had a huge effect on obedience rates. Not changing the people, but changing the environment. These are massive effects. This, not such a massive effect. You see this in other places as well. And these effects contradict our intuitions in interesting ways. So consider the well-known phenomena of bystander non-intervention. Some emergency happens out there in the world, and people just walk by and do nothing. Right? It's shocking sometimes. Walter Vance was shopping on Black Friday in West Virginia in a Target store. Black Friday is the day after Thanksgiving when all the stores open up and people apparently go crazy. Well, in the middle of the night, in a Target store, he had a heart attack, fell down on the floor, and he died there. And what bystanders noted, or what people noted in the store, was that people for several hours walked over him without intervening at all. Now, intuitively, when we think about this from a non-behavioral science perspective, we think, what the hell is wrong with these people? How could you walk by a dying man and do absolutely nothing? Right? Indeed, that's that was what one of Vance's friends said. Where is the Good Samaritan side of people? How could you not notice someone was in trouble? I just don't understand if people didn't help what their reason was, other than greed because of a sale. That is, it was something about them, those greedy bastards who go out at Target stores on Black Friday. That's why they didn't intervene. And yet, one of the things we know very profoundly is that you're less likely to intervene. There are lots of other people around because you're not so sure it's an emergency. You're not quite sure what to do, right? Don't have much expertise. In fact, the people who eventually intervened to help Walter Vance were nurses, so they knew what to do. And there's ambiguity about whether it's actually an emergency or not. So we know that this guy died of a heart attack, but you're walking through a Target store in the middle of the night. I don't know, has he had too much to drink? Is he sleeping? Nobody else seems concerned about this, and so you don't intervene. The behavioral science perspective notes the context on this, and if you were to modify that context, you could get people to intervene hugely. If you had only one other person in the store, and you saw somebody fall down, you would help. 100 other people in the store, and you saw somebody fall down, you probably would, or you'd be less likely to. We see this in other places as well. Down in this part of town, when things go bad, right? Somebody goes off the reservation supposedly in a bank. What's the problem? Is the problem with the bank, or the culture of the bank, or the culture of the banks? No, it's with the trader. It's a rogue trader. We've identified a black hat. And apparently, there are lots of these. Because if you look for rogue traders on the internet, you find them all over the place. In fact, there are even 2 Wikipedia entrances for rogue trader. One is for the band. I have no idea if they're any good or not. The other is defining what a rogue trader actually is. There is no entry for rogue culture. Right? When we see people doing unethical things in organizations, we point to them, something about them. Right? That's our inclination. That happens, as psychologists suggest, in fact, to be wrong. You see this in other places too. John Cassidy, writing for the New Yorker, wrote in my book, I angered some people by suggesting that the Wall Street CEOs involved in the run-up to the financial crisis were neither sociopaths nor idiots nor felons. For the most part, they're bright, industrious, not particularly imaginative Americans who worked their way up, cultivated the right people, performed a bit better than their colleagues, and found themselves occupying a corner office during one of the great credit booms of all times. This, by the way, is almost word for word what Hannah Arendt said about Eichmann, World War II as well. So we have this common belief that it's really the people. There are good guys and bad guys. And identify the good guys will be great. Identify the bad guys will be even better. The truth is that mythical figures are good and bad, black and white. Everybody else is gray. The truth is most people are gray. We've got good and bad things about us. People can do good things and bad things. When you see unethical behavior happen out there in the world, it's often with complex figures like this, or like this man here, Elliot Spitzer, who was trying to do very good things on Wall Street, but not always with certain individuals. The second common myth is that it's all about your motives. It's all about your intentions, what you want. Right? It's all about your motives and your intentions. Bad acts are guided by bad intentions. Good acts are guided by good intentions. And so we really need to pay attention to our intentions. Most of us don't intend to do bad things, and so we don't think unethical behavior is likely to be a problem for us. Baumeister described this phenomena as the myth of pure evil, the assumption that people do evil with evil intent. But in fact, what he noted, when you actually look at instances of people doing what we would recognize as evil, they don't think they're doing evil themselves. They often think they're doing things for a good, moral, ethical, justifiable reason. We presume, though, that evil acts are caused by evil intent. It's more complicated than that. Consider this man here, who I think we would all recognize as somebody we'd identify as evil. But what was his psychology? Did he have evil intent? Well, it's not so clear. Here's what he reported in an interview with Vanity Fair about how things started out. Did he start out intending to defraud people of millions and millions and millions of dollars? He said, well, you know what happens is it starts out with you taking a little bit, maybe a few hundred, a few thousand, you get comfortable with that, before you know it, it snowballs into something big. Everybody on the outside kept claiming I was a sociopath about his wife. She feels sorry for me because she knows I'm not a horrible person. He did horrible things. Was he a horrible person who had horrible intent at the beginning? That seems implausible to me as a psychologist. Much more plausible is that he made some mistakes early on. That turned into a big problem over time. And indeed, often the perspective that we have as observers on the outside is very different from what the perspective of somebody inside the situation has. So consider this example from Roy Baumeister that he gave in his book. He described a friend of his who was in an airport. She sat down at a table, and there was another guy sitting right here across the table from her. She sat down, she gets out her lunch, and she starts eating, and she's doing a little bit of work. And about a few minutes into it, something really weird happens. The guy standing across from her kind of smiles weirdly and reaches over and takes one of her chips, potato chips, and eats it. That's weird, right? That's creepy. And she didn't think anything of it at the moment. She said, well, okay, that's weird, but who knows, maybe he's really hungry. And then he did it again. He smiled and he reached over and grabbed one of her potato chips. And at this point, she's feeling really creeped out, because that's really weird, right? That's something wrong with that. And so she picks up all of her stuff, and she puts it in her bag, and she goes off to the airline to get on her plane. When she sits down, she pulls her stuff out of her bag. She pulls out a bag of chips and her sandwich and her laptop, and she reaches in, and there at the bottom is another bag of chips. Turns out, she was eating the other guy's chips, and she had left her bag in her own bag. So what looks evil from one perspective may in fact not look evil at all from the other perspective. And yet, we often make this mistake because the way we understand somebody's intention is we work directly back from their actions. Psychologists refer to this as the fundamental attribution error or the correspondence bias. If I see you do something evil, I infer you had evil intent. I see you do something heroic, I assume you had heroic intent, even if the reality is more sophisticated than that. And so psychologists have been identifying a bunch of ways in which this leads us astray in making inferences about the minds of others. But I think this can also make it hard for us to reason correctly about our own minds, because we also use our own intentions to predict our behavior. That is, we assume that if we have good intentions, we will do good things. And if we don't have bad intentions, we won't do bad things. But that reliance on intention can lead people, in fact, to misunderstand themselves, because intentions aren't as strong as people think they are, even in themselves. Consider this experiment we conducted here. This is one that John mentioned a bit ago. This is a very simple study that we did at Cornell. This was years ago when I was in graduate school. And what we did was we ran this experiment around a charity drive on campus. This happens every year on campuses around the country. The American Cancer Society runs this. And what they do is they sell daffodils for $1. They may have gone up. At that time, it was a daffodil for $1 to benefit the American Cancer Society. And what we did was simple. We asked people to predict how many they would buy when the charity drive came around. We asked them whether they would buy a daffodil and then how many they would buy. And we asked them to make the same predictions for the average Cornell student. Okay? And then what we did was a month later, when after the charity drive was actually over, we contacted those people again. We asked them, how many did you actually buy? Did you buy, and how many did you actually buy? So we could look to see what people actually did and whether they understood themselves accurately or not. What do we find? Well, first we found that people were rather self-righteous. That is, they thought that they would be more likely to buy a daffodil than other people would. What was the truth of the matter? This, by the way, was driven by their intentions to help the charity. That was drove this. I want to do a good thing, and so I would. Others maybe don't want to do such good things. They don't do it. What was the truth of the matter? Well, the truth was that only about 43% of these participants here actually bought a daffodil. They're more calibrated about others in this case than they were about themselves. Their intentions led them astray. The good intentions led them astray. Here's another version of this where we asked them to predict how many they would buy. They predicted they would buy more than others. What was the truth of the matter? The truth was they bought something closer to what they predicted for others than what they predicted for themselves. Our own good intentions can lead us to underestimate the likelihood that we would, in fact, do bad things if we were put in an ethical dilemma, similar to what I think Milgram found as well. The truth of the matter is it's not just about motive. The context is not only powerful, it's surprisingly powerful. That is, it surprisingly affects the relationship between intentions and behavior and muddies that relationship. Bad actions can be done with good intentions, such as when people hire their friends and family or members of their in-groups into a company, but which leads to discrimination as well because you're not hiring members of out-groups. Or when failing to consider the ethical implications of your intentions. That's what Ann Tenbrunzel and Max Bazerman have referred to as ethical blindness. If you behave without ethics in mind, you might behave in ways that are consistent with your ethical principles if you're not thinking of them. The third common myth is that it's all about ethical principles. That it's really about ethical reasoning. And if we could just teach people to reason the right way, if parents could just teach their kids how to think about ethical problems, then people would behave more ethically. But what psychologists have found, in fact, is that reasoning doesn't always precede action. Often it goes in the other way. So psychologists, going back to the days when psychologists were philosophers, had some sense that people are sort of schizophrenic. So Plato described this tension between a chariot driver and a rider, that this chariot driver is sort of our rational, careful, analytical, reasoning self, and then the horses that are pulling the chariot is this sort of emotional, fast, kind of gut-level sense of self, and that the rider, our reasoning, often had a hard time driving or steering the horses. That's a good metaphor, but it's not as good a metaphor as John's metaphor, which I actually like much better, because it more accurately depicts the relative strength of the rider and the horse. In this case, John likens it to a rider on top of an elephant. In fact, turns out our urges, these gut-level emotions, rapid ways of behaving, habits, social influences, are much more powerful than you would guess. And the rider is often weaker than you would guess. The rider is often in a position of figuring out why the elephant went this way and trying to explain it rather than actually steering the thing. The best example of this that I know of, again, comes from John in his phenomena that he describes as moral dumbfounding. And it's a very compelling phenomena, so compelling you can experience it for yourself if you haven't experienced so far. So what John did, this was a few years ago, is he gave people stories that might give their elephant pause, but their rider not. So consider this story here about Jennifer the Cannibal. Jennifer works in a medical school pathology lab as a research assistant. The lab prepares human cadavers that are used to teach medical students about anatomy. The cadavers come from people who have donated their body to science for research. One night, Jennifer is leaving the lab when she sees a body that's going to be discarded the next day. Jennifer was a vegetarian. For moral reasons, she thought it was wrong to kill animals for food, but then when she saw a body about to be cremated, she thought it was irrational to waste perfectly edible meat. So she cut off a piece of flesh and took it home and cooked it. The person had died recently of a heart attack, and she cooked the meat thoroughly, so there was no risk of disease. Is there anything wrong with what she did? Well, yes, that's wrong. Are you kidding? Of course that's wrong, right? Only 13% of people in John's study said, no, there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay. The elephant is telling you, no, this is not, you just can't do this. There's no way that you can do this. The more interesting thing was that when John pushed people, so they would give a reason why they thought it wasn't okay, he'd say, well, what if we took that reason away? Right? There really was no risk of disease, or whatever reason you would give. People would still say, no, it's just wrong. So this really suggests that our reasoning is following a judgment, not preceding it. You see this in lots of other ways as well. I don't care how many times I tell you this is ice cream. You're not going to eat it. You're not going to eat this. Gummy boogers, delicious. Lemon, lime, yummy. You're not gonna eat them. This is not gonna be a top seller. And I don't care how damn thirsty you are, you're not gonna drink out of this. You're just not. All of these cases, you can see that action or behavior or judgment is driven by one thing, and it's not our careful analytical reasoning. Often reasoning is a position of explaining why we're doing what we're doing, rationalizing what we're doing, not leaving it. Ethical reasoning is important, but not as important as we think it is. It's not as powerful as we think it is. And the last myth is this one, is that everyone's different. Everything's relative. I can't tell people about the value of integrity or honesty or caring for customers or clients or doing the right thing because they all have different views than I do. That's my value set, but you might not share this. Now, of course, there's some truth to this. We are all super sensitive to the differences between people. We learn this early in our kids' lives. We point out everybody's different in all these different ways. Yes, everybody's different. Everybody's different. Sure enough, all of that's true. But this is also true. Everybody poops, right? So amidst all of these kind of high-level differences, there are some fundamental species-level similarities that we all share. And it's very easy to overlook those underlying similarities. And yet, when you look for underlying similarities about ethics, you find it over and over and over again. So the golden rule, for instance, has been recreated in almost any culture where anybody has ever looked for ethical principles. This is not an accident. This is kind of built into our species. It turns out that if you follow this particular principle here, the golden rule, you're going to live in a better society. This turns out to be critical for social functioning. So the perception is that there's all this gray area. The truth is, we spend most of our time arguing about this gray area. It can make it seem bigger than it is. There's actually a huge amount of agreement if you look as well. So this is kind of one of the most basic foundations. Care for others as you would have them care for you. There are other important foundations. Again, these are from John here. So he suggests there are 5, maybe 6, maybe 7. Others suggest there are 2. This is the kind of thing psychologists love to busy their time with. How many are there? Not so clear. There's at least these, right? And what John does in his experiments is he measures sort of the strength of these different foundations, care, fairness, community, authority, sanctity, by asking people to imagine how much they would have to be paid to do each of these things. So for care, stick a needle into your arm versus stick a sterile needle into your child's arm. And the scale here is just an increase in dollar amounts. So as an indication that I need to be paid more to do something that was unethical. I need some other compensation because this seems wrong. These are from my students, and what do you find? Well, you find that number 2 is going to require more money than number 1 on every one of these dimensions. That is, everybody recognized some ethical force behind all of these different dimensions. These are from my Chicago MBA students. John finds exactly the same thing in his data. So this is a paper from 2009 that he published. Now, it's important to note there are differences here. John highlights the differences across the political divide, that people with different political points of view value these things in different ways. Notice there are differences, but notice if you didn't care about these foundations at all, you'd have 0. There's a lot more similarity here than there is difference. We care about differences as psychologists and as scientists, but in your daily lives, you also care about similarities. And I think this is an important point because, in fact, we see these kinds of foundations showing up in monkeys and in infants as well, for fairness, for loyalty. We care about this shared similarity because that's often what you're appealing to in your organizations. You're putting into place interventions. You're appealing for people to behave in a particular way, to get behind one particular mission or another. It might be easier for people to get behind what you're selling to them than you think. So why do we care about this? First off, I think these 4 myths lead to a common misperception, and that misperception is that unethical behavior is a belief problem. That it's about beliefs. That if I can just stuff things into your head, you'll take them out, I can train you in the right way, I can teach you the right things, then you'll go off and do good things. That's, in fact, not that simple. Behavioral science suggests, in fact, that we'd be better off thinking about ethics as a design problem. How do we create an environment that enables great people like you and I to be in situations where they can be as good as they might otherwise want to be? To design things effectively, we have to appeal to our constraints. This is often the way we think about people. We stuff their heads full of things. They've got all kinds of good ability to reason. They can remember things really well. Then they'll go off and behave independently. In fact, real people look more like this often. We have significant limitations that we have to attend to. These are the 4. First is we have limited memory. Can't remember everything. Second, we have limited attention. Third, we tend to pursue only one goal at a time, even if we care about lots of different things. Third, we are highly social. And what I think this suggests, then, is that we need to think about ethical design by appealing to this kind of framework. I think there are 4 important components to keep in mind. The first are explicit beliefs. What do people believe we're actually trying to do here? This is about mission statements and values. All of you have some intuitions about that. Often these are designed poorly. They're long on statement and short on mission. They're often things that people can't remember. Mission statements are good when people can remember them. Second, the importance of thought during judgment. People behave in ways that are consistent with what they're thinking about right now, not with what you told them a month ago. So we have to think about what are people thinking about when they're confronting a decision when they make it, and can you prime them to keep ethics top of mind? That turns out to be important. Third, incentives. All of you think lots about incentives. Most of you think about money. That's the chief incentive. We think about people want lots of things. They want purpose and meaning. They care about their reputation as well. These other factors, reputation in particular, can be used very effectively as an incentive to drive ethical behavior. And finally, cultural norms is probably more important than anything else. We're social. We tend to do what other people do. What you have to do in an organization to create an ethical culture is include ethics in all the key drivers of day-to-day activity that actually drive behavior. Hiring, promotion, evaluating, firing, rewarding. If you're not talking about ethics at each of those stages, it's not going to become part of the day-to-day fabric. And the other important thing about creating norms is that often when we talk about ethics, we talk about the bad actors, the black holes. That creates a sense that everybody's doing bad things, and that just is not true. We also need to highlight the beacons. Who in our organization is doing the right thing? What banks out there are doing good things? What companies out there are behaving in the right way? Just by talking about the bad actors, which we often do, we can create a sense that everybody's doing bad things. That can, in fact, be self-defeating. Now, the hope is that as the rest of the group fleshes out these ideas over the course of the day, we refine our thinking a little bit from both sides. Number one, the practitioners in the room get some sense of what behavioral science suggests about problems that are important to them, but we'd also love to hear more about how you're applying these kinds of things in your actual organizations. Thanks so much for your time.